I recently had the opportunity to tour the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise while it was at sea. The entire experience was fantastic, but the highlight for me was sitting with Rear Admiral Raymond Spicer, commander of the Enterprise's Carrier Strike Group, and watching FA-18 Hornet jets taking off and landing at night. What an incredible sight! There was beauty in the way the jets shot off the deck and others landed, coming to a halt in a mere 2 seconds. But what struck me even more was the number of people who seemed to be involved in the process, and the teamwork that was required. When I asked Admiral Spicer about it, he put me in contact with Lieutenant Commander Ryan Smith, the V-2 Division officer, who explained the process to me. He said, "The pilot is seated at the controls of an FA-18 Hornet as the jet is accelerated from 0 to nearly 160 miles per hour in the span of less than 3 seconds. As the aircraft climbs away from the carrier, she raises the landing gear and is suddenly alone in the black of night. There are few examples of solitary combat in today's era of modern networked warfare, but an aviator seated in the cockpit of one of today's Navy fighters still seems like an example in which the accomplishment of a particular objective is entirely dependent on the talent, skill, and effort of one particular highly trained individual. However, the singular act of catapulting a jet off the end of one of these carriers is the result of the complex orchestration of scores of individuals, each with a mastery of his or her own specific task. It is the efforts and coordination of these individuals, most of whom are just barely high school graduates, which serve as a truly inspiring example of teamwork." He then went on to explain the process. Hours before that jet taxis to the catapult for launching, it is inspected by a team of mechanics and technicians. While the pilot is receiving a briefing on the mission, including weather, target information, radio procedures, and navigational information, all of which are produced by teams of sailors, the aircraft is going through an equally rigorous period of preparation. The pre-flight routine ends only when the pilot has reviewed the aircraft's maintenance records and inspected the aircraft for flight. 30 minutes prior to the aircraft's launch time, a specific sequence of steps begins that is always followed with precision. The aircraft carrier's air boss calls for engine starts, a test to make certain that the jets are in proper working order, while the pilot runs through his pre-taxi checks. The aircraft's plane captain is listening to the engines and watching the movement of each control surface as the pilot does his checks. Once it is determined that everything is okay, the aircraft is then topped off with fuel. Meanwhile, the aircraft handling officer, seated in flight deck control and using a tabletop model of the carrier's flight deck and aircraft, reviews the launch sequence plan with the deck caller. The aircraft handling officer radios the deck caller, telling him which aircraft are reported to be up and ready to taxi. The deck caller leads 3 separate teams of plane directors and other sailors from the carrier's flight deck division, and each team is responsible for a different area of the flight deck. These teams ensure that each aircraft to be launched is safely unchained, directed around other parked aircraft, often with only inches of clearance, and put in line to be launched, sometimes as the deck of the carrier is pitching and rolling. When the deck caller gets the okay, the aircraft goes into one of the 4 catapults. On deck, final maintenance checkers walk alongside the aircraft and inspect each panel and component as crew members from the catapult and arresting gear division hook the aircraft up to the catapult mechanism and ready it for launch. Below deck, other teams are using hydraulics and other equipment to control steam from the nuclear reactor that will be used to power the catapult. At this time, ordnance personnel arm the aircraft's weapons. The catapult officer then confirms the weight of the aircraft with the pilot. He also makes note of the wind over the deck and ambient conditions. He performs calculations to determine the precise amount of energy needed to achieve flight.